This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Folks, before we get into my discussion with David Howden, let me make this announcement. Join the Mises Institute for our annual Supporters Summit in Delray Beach, Florida, this October 16th through 18th. We'll enjoy a weekend of camaraderie and freedom revolution plotting. Economic and civil liberty have always been behind American greatness, and America cannot be great again if it's not free again. That's why this year's theme is Make America Free Again. Featured guests include Lou Rockwell, Tom DiLorenzo, Joe Salerno, Guido Hulsman, Tom Woods, me, and many more. Our keynote speaker will be the popular Mises Wire contributor, libertarian journalist, and prolific author James Bovard. Registration is $475 per person, and you must be a Mises Institute member to register. For more information, go to Mises.org/SS25. Again, this is for October 16th through 18th, our Supporters Summit in Delray Beach, Florida. We hope you can make it. For more information, go to Mises.org/SS25. Hope to see you there. Dave, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bob.
So the reason I have you on here is to discuss, you are the editor of a collection that was put out entitled The Next Generation of Austrian Economics, Essays in Honor of Joe Salerno. So can you explain what was the impetus for that project?
Yeah, actually co-editor. I did it with Per Byland. Mm-hmm. And the original motivation was, the Mises Institute has a summer fellows program for young scholars, typically PhD students. I don't know how many have gone through. Did you do it when you were younger, Bob?
Yes. I think from my second year onward of grad school. Yeah.
You did it. Peter Klein I don't know if it existed when Peter was in grad school, but maybe he did like a proto.
I don't know if Menger had yet written when Peter was in grad school.
Maybe. Anyway, now there's been quite a few summer fellows who have come through, and we wanted to put together a collection of essays from some of the better known fellows to kind of honor Joe, because he puts a lot of work and effort into it, and it's a great opportunity for young scholars to get together and bounce ideas off each other, and then get feedback from Joe and other scholars who are down.
Because, forgive me, I just don't remember if you actually said this out loud, but because he kind of runs, that's not the right word, but he's like the academic overseer, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, he's
plantation master, whatever term we want to use.
He goes by many different terms, I think. But yeah, he oversees the program. I think Guido Hulsman used to do it, and then Joe took over.
Right, yeah, that's my recollection too. That first it was Guido.
When you did it, it was Guido. But Joe does it. Joe did it when I went through. I went through in 2009 and 2010, 2 years, I guess, and Joe continues to do it. So Per and I wanted to put together a collection of essays to say thanks to Joe for putting it together and give him something tangible to show for his efforts.
Great, yeah. So all of the contributors to this book, it's not just that they're young and up and coming, but they also were ones that had gone through the summer fellowship program at the Institute.
Yeah, that was the base criterion. We wanted people who had spent the summer there at the Mises Institute under Joe's tutelage. And then we also wanted them to be up and coming in some way, or some of the better known scholars.
Right. And they couldn't be Keynesian. That was the other criterion.
We didn't allow monetarists. We were on the fence about a little bit, but Keynesians were excluded.
Okay, well, great. So I don't know how you want to go through this. What we're basically doing here, folks, is I'm trying to let everyone know about the existence of this book. And I had toyed with having every author come on, but then the problem with that is if I didn't let every single person come on, some might feel slighted, and I probably didn't want to devote that many episodes just to this one idea. So I thought, okay, and I've had Per on for other things, so that's why you're here, Dave. So you want to just maybe go through and give a summary with saying at the outset, if we don't cover someone's chapter, it doesn't mean because it's not as good as the other ones, but we have limited time.
Well, I was going to say because if I misrepresent somebody, then all the blowback comes on me and not you.
Right.
Thank you for that. So when we solicited chapters, Per and I originally, we broke up the I guess, the topics into three different areas. So we have about a third of the book is devoted to money and banking, because that's completely where Joe Salerno, where I consider Joe to be firmly rooted, is in this money and banking tradition. We have a third of the book devoted to more mundane topics in economics, like more technical topics in economics, which, again, Joe's made a lot of inroads in technical econ and just the nut and bolts of how it works. And then we have a third of the book, which is more maybe policy oriented, I guess you could call it, which Joe, this is, I think, a little appreciated field that Joe is in the policy side of things. And so thematically, that's how the book gets organized between money and banking and mundane and policy views on economics. And then the goal in each chapter was to have something influenced by Joe in some way, or maybe more to the point, to have something that's very firmly rooted in Austrian economics, and then put a hook on it that connects it to Joe in some way. So I don't know if you realize this, but it's an apt time to review the book, because it's 10 years old this spring. We would have presented it to Joe at AERC in 2015. Mm-hmm. So we're at the 10-year anniversary. And
I am familiar with arithmetic, yes, but that was not the reason for...
Just making sure.
Yeah.
Because you're an Austrian, so
right,
we're not always sure about that. And so it's a nice time to go back. And of course, every author has a bias that they think that their book is being overlooked or their ideas are not appreciated. Right. But I think because the book is filled with young scholars that maybe people didn't know at a time, there's a lot of really nice contributions in it that might go overlooked. I don't know how you wanted to do it. If you wanted me, I could just pinpoint what some of the better ones are.
Maybe grab some that you think are particularly noteworthy, and if possible, like some from each of those buckets that you mentioned, would probably, just to give, in case the listeners have different preferences, if possible.
Yeah, sure. Well,
and let me just mention too, though, like, can you just speak a bit? Because I remember when I first encountered, what is it, Festschrift? That word that we use, that we imported from Germany, I guess, is to, essays in honor of, like, especially for like a senior scholar, where a bunch of the people who have been influenced and revere the person, they do a collection of essays. And because the reason I'm saying it is because you said one of the things, it was almost like an offhand remark about, and each of the things is supposed to latch on to something that Joe did in his work. And I remember the first time I read through one of those Festschrifts, I was surprised by how little some of the contributions, and I realized, like, it's a loose, it's an open-ended thing. It's not like every single chapter has to be, what I'm going to respond to is his 1974 paper where he said this, and I think he's either right or wrong. And that's the other thing too, is you're allowed to disagree with the person, like, because it's an academic thing. So anyway, I just wanted to explain that in case people thought it was like literally like reading notes of tribute at the guy's birthday party. No, it's academic. It's not like that.
I want to point something out about this, because it is a Festschrift. It's essays in honor of an academic. This is a bit of my field, because I've edited 2 Festschrifts in my life, one for Joe Salerno, this one, and one for Jesus Huerta de Soto, 2 years ago. And Festschrifts, when you talk to people who know what they are, and especially if you talk to book publishers about this, they cringe, because they are typically places where the invitees put their old forgotten papers and articles that they couldn't place anywhere else.
Right.
This is like the graveyard for those. And I'm quite proud about this one for Joe, because it's obvious that we're dealing with 13, 14 chapters that are specifically written for this, and firmly, when you read it, you understand that, no, this is a true Festschrift. Like, we are somebody.
You're like, no, when these authors 5 years ago, they were in diapers, so they couldn't possibly be resurrecting forgotten manuscripts.
That's it. So I'll tell you the first one that I really appreciated at the time, Xavier Mera, who's French, and he was a fellow at the Mises Institute. I think more than one summer, but one summer when I was there anyway. So I know Xavier quite well. And one of his fields was on monopoly pricing. And he's got a chapter in the book, a note on monopoly pricing. This is one of these mundane economics contributions that I was talking about. And the typical Austrian view on monopoly pricing was, you can start with Mises, where, okay, you face this inelastic demand curve at the competitive price or above the competitive price, and a monopoly can happen. That's That's pretty Misesian. And then Rothbard comes along and appends that and says, well, it corrects Mises. He says, no, it's got to be a result of government intervention. Monopoly has to be very much a political outcome. And then Xavier, very much in this tradition of Rothbard, corrects Rothbard and corrects Mises and says, well, you guys are very much focused on the demand side, Mises on the elasticity of the demand curve and the equilibrium price or the market clearing price. And Xavier comes forward and says, well, it also has to do with the supply side and it has to do with the cost structure, because if you have falling costs as you restrict output, you can definitely get a monopoly under those conditions. And so that was a very nice contribution that Xavier made that corrected what was the status quo view on monopoly pricing and Austrian theory. And that's really nice. I mean, that's one I love it because it's mundane economics. It's one of these technical things, but you must appreciate, since you came out of a PhD program, that those technical things, those nuts and bolts, are really what form broader theories. So making sure that you've got a consistent and correct theory across the board, including monopoly pricing, is really instrumental in constructing a larger theory. So that was a really nice mundane contribution from Xavier.
Let me just speak to a minute in case some listeners are like, why are you saying mundane? And it's not like a backhanded compliment. David means that sincerely or earnestly. And I'm painting here with a broad brush, but there is this tendency, this outcome, and we don't know why, but it is the case that scholars who are interested in Austrian economics, who tend to be associated with the Auburn Mises Institute crowd, are very interested and do a lot of work on just what you might consider to be, like Dave said, nuts and bolts economics. Like, I do capital and monetary theory, things like that. What causes the business cycle? Those kinds of things. Monopoly pricing, like he just talked about. Whereas there's another wing that tends to be associated with like the GMU branch, who are into like, the future is uncertain and open-ended, and how can we talk about social conventions? Let's use the lens of Hayekian pattern coordination and right. And so anyway, I'm just saying that's partly what Dave is pointing to. There are many of us who think like, hey, we're economists, and I'm sorry if some people think this is boring, but it's important to know like where market prices come from and stuff like that, and to understand banking. And
I'll also add to that, because I didn't think about it until you said it, but there is a negative connotation with the word mundane, correct?
There could be. That's why I clarified that you weren't. Yeah.
I think people think that you mean boring. I only just pieced this together in the last couple of years, but mundane, it comes from the Latin mundo, and literally it means pertaining to this physical world instead of something heavenly or more esoteric. And in economics, and especially with monopoly pricing, I think it's a very apt word, because Austrian economists are very, there's this causal realist. They're very nuts and bolts, what's actually happening in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's a nice term to use, as opposed to, you get all sorts of other economists, like you say, that are much more esoteric, abstract.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, great. On that, do you remember, because I don't know if you reread the thing before we jumped on this call, is it changing? I mean, because Rothbard, I remember in like Man, Economy and State, he was going through, and he was putting a lot of emphasis on thought experiments and things like, hey, if you're the first entrant into some new field, like you have some new product that no one's done before, like, yeah, you have 100% of the sales, but that's we want you to do that. You know what I mean? Like the benchmark is not, well, let's contrast that with a different industry where that product is produced by 1,000 different suppliers who all have identical factories and blah, blah, blah. It's like, why would you do that? Yeah, there is some weird sense in which maybe that would be better, but we don't have that. Right now, it's no one else knows how to even make this thing, and there's this guy who does. Are we saying he can't sell that at whatever price voluntary transactions foster?
Yeah, and Rothbard, he's got this piece where, when he's criticizing Mises, because Mises focuses very much on the competitive price. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a mainstream, as mainstream as you could really be, I suppose, if you're Mises at the time. But and Rothbard says, well, you don't really know what the competitive price is, because you can have you can have one person, you can have a monopolist who is selling at the competitive price, whatever that is. And I guess then, you've got Block later using these thought experiments like, well, everybody is a monopolist owner of their own labor services. For example, I think this comes out of Rothbard too. And so there's all these thought examples that you can use.
Right. Like I am the only one who can sell consulting services by Robert P. Murphy. Right.
Yeah.
There is another economist at Boston College who's Robert Murphy, and I feel bad for that guy because people are like, "Oh, you guys don't like Krugman?" He's like, "No, it's that other kid." But okay, I'm probably making you take too long on this one. So what else do you want to talk about from this book?
I would talk about one that I appreciated at the time, but I appreciated much more after the fact. Simon Bilo, who's a little bit younger than me, so he would have come through the Summer Fellow program maybe 2015-ish. I don't know exactly, but let's say right around then. He has a chapter on subjectivism in international economics. Of course, one of Joe's primary fields is international monetary systems. And Bilo is talking about why absolute purchasing power parity doesn't hold true. And there's this paradox. If anybody is an economist, an international economist, there's this paradox that absolute purchasing power parity says that the same good selling in two different markets should sell at the same price once you abstract from transportation and distribution costs and tax differences and things like that. So a Ford, an iPhone, once you abstract from transportation and tax differences and things like that, should be selling for the same in New York City as it is in Shanghai. Let's say that would be absolute purchasing parity in a nutshell. And then it's a really nice theory because, of course, it's a strong arbitrage condition there. If they're selling at a cheaper price in Shanghai than they are in New York City, you just buy them in China and ship them over to New York and sell them and earn the profit. And you're just going to arbitrage that profit until the price is equalized. So the theory is really nice and convenient. It's also important for a lot of technical economics that we have that arbitrage condition. And then empirically, when we go around the world, we find that absolute purchasing power parity doesn't really hold very well, even abstracting from tax differences and transportation expense and things like that. So there's this real paradox.
Can I stop you just for a second, Dave? Yeah. And this is why, for people to understand like why this actually is relevant, even it's mundane, but it also is important and it has implications besides just like, that's interesting. For example, if you say, what's the biggest economy in the world right now in terms of output? I've been telling people, well, it's funny because like the official answer is the U.S. and, China's second, but that's so obviously their GDP is reported in terms of their local currency. The U.S. GDP officially is measured in dollars and China in the yuan. And so you say, okay, well, how do we compare the two, make it apples to apples? And you say, you look at the foreign exchange rate, right? You look at the currency markets where people are trading the U.S. and Chinese currencies against each other, then the U.S. has a bigger GDP, GDP measured in those terms. But if instead you use what's called purchasing power parity, a lot of times you just say PPP, that adjustment where, again, you say, well, let's get a basket of consumer goods and like what would $100 buy you? Okay, and then you look at those goods and you say that same basket of goods in China, how much of their local currency would people have to spend to get that basket of goods? You get that number and you say that's the true sense in which $100 trades for that many yuan or renminbi. I forget, how they would use it in that context. And then use that. And if you do it that way, China's had a bigger economy since like 2014, right? And so, anyway, I'm just saying that this isn't some slight little 2% difference. Like it really does matter. And arguably, the purchasing power approach is a better gauge of like the welfare of the people and whatnot. But economists are like, but it's awkward. Like, how come the market exchange rate's not reflecting that? Okay, so I just wanted to show people that this can make a big difference depending on which metric you use to put currencies on, comparable footings.
Yeah, just another example. I teach international economics, and as a vague theoretical exercise, I love doing these PPP comparisons, like the example that you just gave with Chinese GDP and American GDP. And then when I sit down with a class and we try to work through the calculations, I hate it because you're sitting there, once you get down to the nuts and bolts and you really have to think, well, what is the basket and what relevance does the basket, once you start asking those questions, what are we actually comparing? It's a really tricky exercise. So it's one of those things in economics and I'm speaking here maybe in mainstream economics, but more so economics in general. It's from the bird's eye view or from the abstract point of view, you can throw terms around. And then when you start defining them and try to use them, it's really pretty tricky. So Simon Bilo, he takes this, he starts the springboard as the paradox of absolute PPP.
I'm sorry, Dee, let me just stop you real quick. Because what's interesting, what you're saying here, I didn't even realize how deep the problem went, or the puzzle, is because I thought the quick answer, like for China, for one thing, they could be, quote, manipulating their currency, right? Like if the Chinese government is devoting massive amounts of their tax revenue to buying treasuries, you could argue that's artificially strengthening the dollar against their current, okay, whatever. But beyond that, just stuff like, well, if the basket includes things like haircuts, you can't buy a cheaper haircut in China and export it. And so I just assumed, oh yeah, it's a bunch of stuff like that. But you're saying, no, even things where it's clearly something that could be put into a box and shipped across the ocean, even there, the arbitrage seems to be violated. And the question is, what's going on here?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Okay. Yeah, it's not just the non-tradable goods like haircuts. It's also strictly speaking the pig iron, the tradables that are selling at different prices, and that's because PPP is such a fundamental part in economics. That arbitrage, that arbitrage condition is so important for all sorts of pricing theory. You need to make sure that it holds true. So then when you're empirically testing it and you're seeing there's violations to it, that's really strange. Like alarm bells are going off in all sorts of people's minds. So Simon Bilo, in his chapter, he talks about when he integrates subjectivism into this purchasing power parity puzzle, he starts talking about how, it's even though they're the same good, they have different uses in different countries. So subjectivity states that we're going to have different valuations put on them, and you should expect to see violations to absolute purchasing power parity. And that seems really basic. I think that's the right word to describe that, because once you say it out loud, and I consider that many things with subjectivity, once you say them out loud, they seem really basic and obvious. But until somebody says them out loud, you don't really realize how important it is.
Right.
So as a case in point, do you remember back post-COVID, all the inflation that was due to that was allegedly due to short-term supply chain disruptions?
Oh, I remember quite well, because that was the reason all the MMTers were saying the reason we were wrong was because we were right.
Yeah. And it was really a frustrating period. It was a very frustrating period of time for many reasons.
Yeah. But that was unfair. It wasn't merely the MMTers. It was Paul Krugman also. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was basically everybody. Everybody was in on that supply chain disruption boat. And the interesting thing was, like, the computer chip shortage as a prime example. Well, computer chips are a fairly standardized product. There's only a couple of companies that are really making them in the world. You got your AMDs, you got your Intels and your NVIDIAs, basically. They're selling all around the world, and they're selling at different prices all around the world, by the way, and this is violating absolute PPP. And this is a really strange paradox during that period, and lots of people were just blaming it on localized supply chain disruptions. Well, it's not immediately clear to me, by the way, that there was localized supply chain disruptions everywhere in the world during that period. To the extent that you use that argument, it was a pretty American-centric thing going on. There was trouble in the port, whatever the stories were, but you're not translating that into all sorts of other countries around the globe. And so the chips are selling at different prices all over the place. Absolute PPP is being violated. The reason that they're giving is that it's supply chain disruptions. That doesn't seem to be a very universal argument that you're giving me. And when I sit down and I think about it, it doesn't seem like it can even be true, because those supply chain disruptions are really localized in one country. And so Simon Bilo, he comes out with the subjectivism argument that they're being put to different uses. They have different valuations placed on them as a result, and that's what's causing the prices to differ in different geographic locations. And I think that's a beautiful application that makes sense in the shortest amount of time, a very deep puzzle in modern economics.
Okay, so I like that, but I think it raises the issue of, and forgive me if this is obvious, but couldn't you say, oh, right, and that's why, just forget international context, that's why, I don't know, the same level of skilled labor is hired at $100 an hour here and $70 an hour over here is because the first employer values them more. And that's why the same type of workers are getting paid different. And that's why an apple sells for $1 a pound here and $2 a pound across the street because of subjective value. Wouldn't that still raise the question? But if we assume that the owners of those resources subjectively value more money to less, still, why don't they just sell to the person who's offering the most money?
It's probably, in that argument that you just gave, I'd probably focus more on complementary goods, no? Like, why is labor valued more highly in the States than it is in, I don't know, Rwanda? That's probably a bad example. Mali. And I would think that it's complementary goods that are necessary to go along with labor.
I guess what I'm saying though is, all right, maybe that analogy doesn't do it. Go back to this, what we're talking about. Still, if iPhones are selling at $100 in Shanghai and they're selling at $150 in New York, and you explain that by, because the people subjectively value them more in New York than Shanghai, or in some defined sense of what does it mean to compare people's subjective valuations. Still, if somebody can buy it 100 and ship it across the ocean for $30 and sell it at whatever I said, I'm forgetting my numbers.
Yeah, I get you.
Still, you explain why the local prices are what they are, but isn't that arbitrage argument still there? I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I would say diminishing returns, because is Intel just shipping 100% of their chips to San Francisco? Or, as an example where they're valued very highly, and there's diminishing returns. So obviously San Francisco or whatever, I mean, it's not San Francisco because that's not the production hub, but whatever the production hub is, has got diminishing returns that they're not going to absorb the whole supply. And so at some point in time, you're going to need to unload your supply in other markets. So then the question is, well, why are you unloading it at different prices in different markets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
What's interesting too, I wonder if at any point would Simon have come to you and say, instead of us publishing this, why don't you and I just pool our capital and we'll make an arbitrage profit? Like, in other words, if it turned out there really is no impediment, that we could just go make 62%, in 3 months. So let's go do that.
Well, that's exactly why PPP is such a great one, because since there's the obvious profit motive involved, empirically testing that one is really easy because the arbitrage, it's a real arbitrage in the sense that you can actually make money off this.
Right.
So when there's deviations in it, then it begs the question, well, why is nobody, picking up these pennies that they could be?
Yeah, and there's last thing, because I know I want to have you let you explain some other ones here, but it's just a funny story. I don't know if you ever heard this, Dave. I don't know how popular this is in the in the field, but I can't remember the guy's name, but there was somebody who was like a founding father of like mathematical finance in the Chicago school tradition. And he was one of the early pioneers in studying warrant pricing, which is kind of like options or whatever, but it's an earlier version of that. And so he and his co-author or whatever, early on when they came up with their model, there was some companies' warrants that they thought were underpriced, undervalued by the market, and they were like, what the heck? And so then they went in and bought up a bunch of them because their model was telling them this thing should have a price of 100 and it's selling in the market at 80. Okay. And then, right after they established their position, some news came out about a lawsuit or a merger or something, and then the prices collapsed, and they lost a boatload of money. And so the point being that they realized, there was some information that the insiders in the markets knew about that we didn't, and that's why our model was given the wrong. And so anyway, the kind of lesson was, as outsiders studying this stuff, if there seems to be this obvious arbitrage opportunity that's just persisting, probably there's something else going on. And so as a mere academic, you probably want to be careful. But if you say, I guess just thousands of people don't know what the heck they're doing, and we're going to go in and make free money. So anyway.
It's ironic that came out of University of Chicago finance, and that that the academics think it's mispricing when in fact it's just the market incorporating information that the academics didn't know about.
Yes, I hope it. I mean, like I said, the story is correct as far as I think the guy was associated with Chicago, but yes, he's definitely. And people are going to in the comments tell me who it was, but okay. What else would you like to cover from this collection?
I have to do my own.
Oh yeah, of course you do.
I have to. So I wrote a chapter that I call Money, and I am very influenced by Joe. and his views on money, and also his views on mundane, on basic technical economics, really shaped me as a young economist. And the way that I treat money is, normally if you're an Austrian and you're learning about money, you kind of just jump into this definition that money is the generally accepted medium of exchange. It's what we're using to buy goods and services. In some sense, it's not really that different from the mainstream's view, or at least the mainstream's definition on money. There's differences in where money comes from and what can serve as money and things like that. But the actual definition, generally accepted medium of exchange, is fairly universal in the mainstream as well. So not that repulses me or anything like that, but we can do better than that, because Austrian economists, even if they have a story that's consistent with what the mainstream's doing, what I appreciate about them is that they're digging deeper to really understand why that story is correct. They're not just making a statement. So I was always a little bit dissatisfied with the Austrian take on money. And so what with that as one half of the story, the other half of the story is I like history. And when you read older economics books on money, and when the functions of money get introduced, and we're used to the medium of exchange, the unit of account, and the store of value, that's very common. There used to be a fourth that nobody talks about today, the standard of deferred payments.
I was going to say that. Like, in other words, I do remember that. You're right. Nobody talks about that anymore. Yeah.
You're old enough. I thought Joe Salerno was
you said it quickly. Let me just make sure the listeners understand. So, as Dave says, if you're reading a standard textbook, and particularly if they're older and they'll talk about money, like in an introductory chapter, they'll say, like, what are the functions of money or attributes, the essential characteristics? And most of them will say a medium of exchange, and I think the better ones will stress, like, generally accepted or widely or universally accepted medium of exchange. Was it store of value? Shoot, what's the other one? The common one?
Unit of account, store of value.
Yeah, unit of account. And then the fourth one that they used to talk about, but now I never hear anymore, is standard of deferred payment? Is that how they say it? And so that's interesting. And in Mises, I'll say one last thing, Dave, that Mises often would take the tack in his writings that, as Dave said, he liked that medium of exchange that's universally accepted, and then he would just say, there's arguments about what does universally accepted mean, but everybody knows what a medium of exchange is. That's clear cut. And he would argue that the other so-called functions of money all flowed from that first one. That, in other words, it wouldn't make sense for it to be a store of value. It has to first be a medium of exchange, and then that's why it would be a store of value, because if that's the thing that everybody's willing to accept, then you can have some of it today and then hold it for 2 years, and then use that because, hey, it's something everyone would accept. Okay, go ahead.
And I just to comment on that, I was always dissatisfied with that approach, to be honest with you, because when you say, I'm not pointing at you, Bob, but because it comes out of Mises, like, money first and foremost has to be a medium of exchange, and therefore it derives from that its function as a store of value. I get dissatisfied from that because technically the only reason I'm accepting US dollars, besides the fact that I'm obliged to by law, so once you overlook that relatively smaller point, is that they act as a store of value. Because even if I was obliged by law to receive US dollars for services rendered, if I wasn't sure that they would retain their value over some time period reasonably well, I wouldn't accept them. I'd work around that.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, and in cases of hyperinflations that destroy a currency, you could say what happened there, and it would be kind of obtuse to say, well, it ceased being a universally accepted medium of exchange. You say, why? I say, well, because everyone knew its value wasn't going to hold. And so it's kind of like, okay, so again, you kind of see.
The causation runs the other way around. So I was never fully satisfied by that. And then there's something else, and this is, I guess, my own methodology. You can probably appreciate it. I think you appreciate it as you get older, but the idea that older generations did things without reason, and we can just change what the older generations were doing. Mm-hmm. As you get older, that strikes you as a little bit foolish because you become the older generation.
Right.
So case in point here, the older generation of economists, they used to talk about these four functions. Then that standard of deferred payments, I know why it disappeared. It's because it used to be, to back up here a little bit, in the 19th century, you could take out a mortgage to buy a house, and that mortgage was defined in terms of gold. that would be the total value, but you would pay off your mortgage in terms of US dollars at whatever the prevailing market exchange rate was. Of course, it's a fixed exchange rate, so it doesn't really make that big a difference. But you used to have a pricing unit for long dated contracts, which was different than the pricing units for, going into a store and buying shirts or buying bananas or whatever it is. Now, the younger generation, later 20th century, because even monetary economics textbooks up until, let's say, the 70s, the 60s for sure would have included these four functions. They say, okay, well, nobody's using a different unit of account for these long dated contracts anymore. It's just US dollars for every contract. So let's not make a distinction anymore. Let's just have one pricing unit for all contracts. And we won't differentiate whether it's, for short-term purchases or longer dated contracts. It's all going to be the same thing. So that's the shift. Well, when I had never learned about those four functions of money, I had always learned three. So it took me a while after I got my PhD reading older monetary textbooks, as one is wont to do, I guess, to really learn those four functions. And as I got thinking about it, I thought, well,
can I stop you for a second, Dave? So you're saying, just for people to really get that, like with the mortgage that would have been issued in the 1870s or something, you're saying the way it was actually written contractually was technically, I owe somebody a physical weight of gold. Yeah. I can pay in dollars, but it's not that I can say right now how many dollars I'm going to owe the person 5 years from now. It's that I know you owe them a certain weight of gold and they can pay in dollars, but the number of dollars we're talking about 5 years from now, they're going to see how many dollars would it take to be worth to fetch that much gold in the market. And that's what you got to, and so on a fixed gold standard, like you're saying, the two are always going to be the same, but strictly speaking, the gold is the thing that's actually contractually binding, and so that's why that's the real money, and the dollar's just tied to it, and then that kind of a framework.
That's it. And by the way, that's really nice if you lack confidence in the dollar, because it's a fixed exchange rate. But then we know that fixed exchange rates are only as good as the government or the central bank's promise to maintain them. So it's nice. And by the way, actually, when I started thinking about this, I've got it in my chapter. If you're a student, an undergrad student, and you're learning about money, you will get thrown all these strange examples of commodities that used to serve as money. So one of them is, you remember learning about the island of Yap?
Yep.
Big round stone discs that they're using as money. Absolutely terrible. Like if you think of those as a medium of exchange, nobody's carrying around these giant stone discs. In fact, there's one story where one was being transported by boat between two islands and the boat sank, and now it's at the bottom of the ocean. And it was still valued, at least it was still valued like in the 70s when I was reading this article, even though nobody was physically exchanging that. Somebody had a claim to this stone disc at the bottom of the ocean.
Right, like that family still, that was part of their portfolio. The other villagers or whatever recognized it. Oh, yes, no, that thing that's in the bottom of the lake, those guys own that, yeah.
So what they're doing with those stone discs is they're actually using them as pricing units. And then they're paying off that value with another type of money that's functioning better as a medium of exchange. So you have this separation between the type of money that's being used to price the contract, which is the stone disc, and the type of money which is being used as the medium of exchange, which you are exchanging at whatever the prevailing market rate is to pay off that contract. A little bit, it's abstract from today's point of view, but then there's all sorts of great historical examples. The funnest one I came across was in Celtic Ireland. There was a system of fines in place in terms of, I think the term was Kumal, Kumal, something like that. Somebody can correct me in the comments. But you would be assessed fines based on an equivalent value of women. And so they had like a hierarchy, like young fecund women are more valuable than less fertile, older, whatever it is. Right? I'm not saying I agree with this, but that's the value system they had. And so you would be given a fine, and then of course you're not exchanging women to pay off this fine. You're not using women as the medium of exchange. You're using something else at market exchange rates. So they had a system of exchange rates like cows and sheep and blah blah blah, and those were what you would use to pay off your fines in ancient Ireland. And so that's, again, we have the separation between the pricing unit and then the medium of exchange. And there's all sorts of examples. We do the same thing like today in the debate over Bitcoin and whether it's money.
Yeah.
It's very rare that you come across something. Well, first of all, it's very rare that somebody's actually exchanging Bitcoin today and using it as money, because everybody just seems to be holding on to it like a financial asset. But that aside, you come across goods that are priced in terms of money. Then they'll tell you what the equivalent in Bitcoin is. And if you want to transfer that many Bitcoin to pay for it, you can. But nobody's pricing goods in Bitcoin because the value is just too volatile. So we use dollars as the unit of account. And then if you wanted to use Bitcoin as money, it would really more narrowly be just medium of exchange. So those are some historical examples where we separate the two functions. And then we still have modern examples of it too, or high inflation countries use US dollars to price goods, and then they use local currency at whatever the prevailing exchange rate is to pay them off. But when I learned about those four functions, getting back to the original story, well, I organized it in my mind. I said, well, that's a great dichotomy that you've got, because you're talking about money in two contexts. It's either a medium of exchange or it's a unit of account. And then you're talking about it whether you're in the short run or you're in the long run, right? Because you've got a pricing unit, a unit of account, and a standard of deferred payments. Well, they're both units of account. It's just whether you're going to be pricing things in short-term contracts or long-term contracts. And then you have two medium exchange. I mean, that's not how we think about the store of value very often. But when you say, oh, I'm holding this because it's a store of value, really what you're saying is I'm holding it to use it at a later date, and it's retaining its value for me. Mm-hmm. And so what you end up with is a medium exchange for a long dated contract versus a medium exchange for a short dated contract. So in my chapter, that's how I organized those four functions of money. I said, no, this fills out a nice 2x2 matrix where you have two functions, not three, two, medium exchange and pricing unit. And then you have short or long run. And then I related this to risk, and I came up with a different definition of money, which I still use and I still like. And I say, well, money is when one good embodies both of these functions simultaneously. It's when you have a good which you are using as a medium exchange, which you are also using as a unit of account. And the reason why I call that money, or the reason why I define that as money, is because I integrate it back into risk and uncertainty theory. Because normally we say, well, we're holding money to, in Mises' evenly rotating economy, we say, well, we're holding money only to pay off uncertain future expenses, the ones that we don't know about ahead of time. And if you just focus on money as a medium of exchange, you don't really get that going on, and that those two theories don't really mesh together as well as you might think. So I say, no, when you have a unit of account and a medium of exchange being embodied in the same good, there's no risk, because your nominal purchasing power is always retained. Like right now, if you want to pay for something in Bitcoin, there's an awful lot of risk, because the good that you're going to buy is really going to be priced in US dollars. You're going to go to the merchant and they're going to say, okay, well, the equivalent value right now is X Bitcoin. And then you're going to see what the going market exchange rate is to transfer over. Well, if Bitcoin falls apart, if you buy it and then it falls apart, you've just exposed yourself to a bunch of risk. That would be no different than you just using a stock. You're saying, okay, well, I'm going to buy this good by selling my stocks at whatever the prevailing price is, the exchange rate between stocks and dollars. That exposes the money holder to a lot of risk. And the whole purpose of money is to avoid that risk and then hedge against this uncertainty. So I said, once you mesh these two roles together, medium exchange, unit of account, then you have what's money. And that seems to me to be a much sounder footing for monetary economics, because you come up with a reason why the medium exchange, you don't just say money is the generally accepted medium exchange. You come up with a theory for why money has to have that role. It's like you turn the causation around.
Okay. That's really, I genuinely appreciate what you're saying there, and I have to kind of let that sink in. And I do like it, because it's not so much that the Misesian framework is wrong, but just, you can come up with examples where it seems a bit contrived or obtuse, I think was the word I used before, where it's clearly if the one element is causing the other one. So he's still correct. Like, the reason that ceased to be money is because it's no longer universally accepted medium of exchange. But if the reason that happened is because one of those other alleged or offshoot functions fell apart, then it does seem to be like, okay. Anyway, so
you know what? I'm going to push back. I don't think it's that obtuse, because there's this big debate over whether Bitcoin is money.
Right.
I'm kind of out of that market, to be honest with you. I'm not following it. But there used to be this vigorous debate whether Bitcoin was money, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was big. And then now, like you're saying, now the new thing is to say going forward, even among people who like Bitcoin, so it's not just like a Peter Schiff or somebody who's like trying to say, no, it's not money, it can't be, blah, blah, blah. Like putting that aside, even among the fans of Bitcoin, there's this big controversy over should it be like this valuable thing that people hodl and just kind of, you pass on to your kids when you die, and then there's some other thing that's on a different chain that are like claims on the Bitcoin, and that's what you use to buy a cup of coffee, or there's a different camp like, no, Bitcoin was supposed to be the thing that we use to buy a cup of coffee, and we have to go back to that vision, right? So that's kind of where so like the analogy would be big gold bars that sit in vaults somewhere, and then people trade claims on that versus gold coins.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to use I don't like the term, but greater fool theory. I'm not using that term to call people who are holding gold or Bitcoin fools, but...
You're not calling them great either, though.
Well, I think it's mildly foolish. Because you got to be honest with what you're doing. You're hoping that somebody's going to buy this off you for a higher price in the future. There's no cash flow generated. There's no dividend stream, and there's no profitability. So you're hoping that somebody's going to buy it off you for a greater price in the future. Now, I'm old enough that I can remember at the beginning of Bitcoin, it was going to be something that was going to revolutionize banking. It was going to kill off banks, and it was going to allow everybody to take money matters into their own hands. That's completely not what's happened in any way whatsoever, because the price volatility is so high that merchants don't want to price in Bitcoin because it's too unpredictable. And then so the unit of exchange is just not happening. And then on the medium of exchange side, rather, nobody wants to use it as a medium of exchange because they're exposed again to so much volatility. Like, what's the exchange rate, Bitcoin for dollars, going to be at the moment in time when I need to buy that car or pay off my mortgage or whatever it is? Or alternatively, people have such rosy-colored glasses on that they don't want to sell their Bitcoin today because they have to hodl or whatever at all costs for the future when the price is higher. Well, it's not becoming money, right? Because we're not using it on either side of the equation. We're not using it as a pricing unit. We're not using it as a medium of exchange. Well, I'm sorry, it's not going to be money unless people use it as money. But it needs a stable value in order for that to happen. Right. So anyway.
Yeah. So there's a lot we could say on this stuff, and my lack of engaging Dave is not that I'm endorsing everything he just said, but I understand. Yes, this is a great application of the kind of concepts you're talking about in your chapter there. So unfortunately, I'm looking at the clock. I think we need to stop it there. I know my constant interrupting you prevented you from getting through most of the book. So again, is it available at the Institute's website?
It's available on everybody's favorite books. The bookseller everybody hates to love, Amazon. It's on the Mises website. It's for free as a PDF on the Mises website, so nobody has any excuse not to read it.
Yeah, so of course, folks, we'll link to it in the show notes page here, but it is showcasing the next generation of Austrian economics, essays in honor of Joe Salerno, edited by Per Byland and David Howden here. So Dave, thanks for stopping by and just giving us some insight into the contents of this book.
Thank you, Bob. Anytime.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.